He thought it was just a favor for an elderly neighbor. A retired Navy SEAL driving her to an animal shelter on a quiet Pennsylvania afternoon. He wasn't there for a dog. He wasn't there for a fresh start. 5 years earlier, he'd already closed the door on that part of his life. Then a young shelter worker showed him a retired military canine no one seemed able to reach. Luke stood by the kennel for only a few minutes. And just as he turned to leave, the shepherd suddenly lunged forward, jumped against him, and covered his face with slobbery kisses. The entire room burst out laughing. Luke wiped his face and muttered, "What did you eat this morning?" It was the first real laugh anyone had heard from him in years. Neither of them knew it yet, but that moment would lead both of them back to life. Before we begin, share the city you're watching from. We'd love to hear from you. And if this story speaks to you, don't forget to subscribe and join us on the journey. Now let's begin. Early autumn settled gently over Lidditz, Pennsylvania. The maple trees lining Oak Street had started to turn, their leaves catching shades of amber and gold. The air carried the faint scent of wood smoke from distant chimneys, and by 6 in the evening, shadows already stretched across front lawns and quiet sidewalks. Luke Brennan noticed none of it. At 39, the former Navy SEAL had become a man who moved through days without really stepping into them. His small craftsman-style house sat halfway down a quiet residential street. It wasn't neglected. The grass was trimmed. The gutters were clean. The porch light worked. Everything functioned exactly as it should. That was the problem. Inside, the house looked almost frozen in time. A white coffee mug sat on the second shelf beside the kitchen sink. Claire had always used that one because the handle was slightly larger than the others. A yellow raincoat still hung in the hallway closet. 3 novels rested on a living room bookshelf, each marked with folded corners where she'd stopped reading. Luke never moved them, not because he planned to keep them forever. He simply never found the courage to decide otherwise. 5 years had passed since the storm. 5 years since Claire left for a grocery run during a violent spring downpour and never came home. People often assumed grief softened with time. Luke had learned something different. Sometimes grief didn't get smaller. Sometimes life simply grew around it. Every morning he climbed into his truck before sunrise and drove wherever work sent him. Luke worked as an independent telecommunications tower safety inspector. Cell companies, utility contractors, and maintenance firms hired him to inspect towers, climbing systems, lightning protection equipment, and structural safety components. Most jobs placed him hundreds of feet above the ground. He liked that. Up there, nobody asked questions. Nobody offered sympathy. Nobody tried to fix him. The wind was usually enough company. By late afternoon, he would drive home, eat dinner alone, watch half of something on television, then head to bed. The next day looked almost exactly the same. The only person who consistently interrupted that routine was Evelyn Parker. At 76, Evelyn lived across the street in a white house with blue shutters and far too many flower pots. She had arthritis in both knees. She also possessed a remarkable talent for finding reasons to knock on Luke's door. One week she needed help changing a porch light. Another week she needed assistance moving a planter. A few days later, she somehow discovered a loose handrail that apparently required immediate attention. Luke knew most of those jobs could have waited. Evelyn knew he knew. Somehow, another project always appeared a few days later. That Thursday morning, Luke was finishing a cup of coffee when a familiar knock sounded at his front door. 3 short taps. Always the same. He opened it. Evelyn stood there wearing a green cardigan and holding a set of car keys. "Morning, Luke." "Morning." She lifted the keys. "I need a favor." Luke almost smiled. "That's new." "It is?" "No." Evelyn nodded as though she appreciated the honesty. "I've got an appointment at the Lancaster Animal Rescue Center." Luke glanced at the keys. "You need someone to drive. My knees need someone to drive." He considered it. His schedule was clear until the following morning. "What time?" 90 minutes. Luke sighed. "I'll grab my jacket." Evelyn's smile widened immediately. By 11 o'clock, they were driving south through Lancaster County. The shelter occupied a renovated brick building outside town, surrounded by fenced exercise yards and small patches of grass where volunteers walked dogs. The moment they entered, barking echoed through the lobby. A volunteer greeted Evelyn by name. Apparently, this visit had been planned for weeks. Luke should have known. While Evelyn completed paperwork for an elderly golden retriever she intended to adopt, Luke wandered toward a hallway lined with photographs of former shelter animals. He was studying a picture of a three-legged Labrador when a voice appeared behind him. "Excuse me." He turned. A young woman stood there carrying a clipboard. 25, maybe. Brown hair pulled into a loose ponytail that looked like it had escaped twice already that morning. The sleeves of her shelter sweatshirt were pushed carelessly to her elbows. A few strands of hair had fallen across her face, but she either hadn't noticed or didn't care. There was an easy energy about her, the kind that made even standing still look temporary. Her eyes were bright, curious, already studying him before she'd said a single word. "Can I ask you something?" she said. Luke immediately suspected he wouldn't enjoy the answer. "Depends." Her eyes dropped briefly to an old military trident sticker attached to his travel mug. "Were you a Navy SEAL?" Luke looked at the sticker, then back at her. "Used to be." The young woman blinked. "Like an actual Navy SEAL?" "I wasn't aware there was another kind," she laughed. The sound came so naturally it caught him off guard. "I'm Sarah." "Luke." "Okay, Luke, serious question." Luke folded his arms. That sentence never leads anywhere good. Sarah ignored him. "Do Navy SEALs eat cereal?" He stared at her. "What? Cereal? I know what cereal is." "Do you eat it?" "Sometimes." Sarah looked genuinely disappointed. "Huh." Luke raised an eyebrow. "What were you expecting?" "I don't know." She thought for a moment. "Something more classified." Luke shook his head. Sarah continued. "Do Navy SEALs actually sleep?" "Usually. Every night. That's generally how sleep works." Sarah laughed again. Luke felt something unfamiliar tugging at the corner of his mouth. Then came another question. And another, and another. Did SEALs really swim insane distances? Had he ever jumped from planes? Was it rare to meet one in real life? Did movies get anything right? Luke answered most questions with one sentence, sometimes one word. Sarah somehow turned each answer into 3 more questions. Nearby, Evelyn completed paperwork while pretending not to listen. The effort wasn't convincing. Then Sarah noticed Luke's forearm. "Okay," she said seriously. "One last question." Luke immediately distrusted that statement. "Sure. Are Navy SEAL arms actually different from normal people arms?" Luke closed his eyes briefly. "Oh no." "For science?" "No." "For educational purposes?" "No." Sarah looked toward Evelyn. "Evelyn?" Evelyn immediately held up both hands. "Leave me out of this." Sarah grinned. Luke sighed. "You're not going to stop asking, are you?" "No." "Fine." Sarah gently pressed 2 fingers against his bicep. Then she stepped back, her eyes widened. "Okay." Luke regretted everything. "Okay, what?" "That's definitely not a normal arm." Evelyn burst out laughing. For one brief moment, Luke did too. A real laugh, short, unexpected, gone almost immediately, but real. The sound surprised him enough that he stopped talking. Sarah noticed. So did Evelyn. Neither said anything. Some moments were better left alone. A few minutes later, Sarah began leading them through the shelter. She introduced dogs, cats, volunteers, stories she somehow remembered about nearly every animal in the building. Luke mostly listened, then Sarah stopped walking. An idea had clearly entered her mind. That usually meant trouble. "You know," she said, "I bet military dogs listen to you immediately." Luke shook his head. "That's not how dogs work. I don't believe you. You should. Come on." Before Luke could respond, Sarah grabbed his sleeve and started pulling him down another hallway. "Sarah, trust me." "I don't." "Perfect. Let's go." The hallway grew quieter. The barking faded behind them. At the very end stood a separate row of kennels. Sarah finally slowed. Her expression softened. For the first time all morning, she wasn't smiling. Luke followed her gaze. A large German shepherd lay alone in the last kennel. And for reasons he couldn't explain yet. He stopped walking. The kennel sat at the far end of the building, beyond the rows of family dogs and adoption rooms, where visitors usually spent their time. The farther Luke followed Sarah down the hallway, the quieter the shelter became. The barking that filled the front building faded into the background. Even the smell changed. The warm scent of shampoo and fresh bedding gave way to something older, concrete, disinfectant, and the lingering traces of animals that had spent too much time waiting. Sarah slowed her pace as they approached the final enclosure. A pair of warning signs hung on the fencing. One advised visitors not to approach without staff supervision. The other simply requested extra caution. Luke noticed both. He also noticed that Sarah stopped talking. Considering she had spent the last 20 minutes asking whether Navy SEALs ate cereal and slept like normal people, the sudden silence felt unusual. "This is Rook," she said. The German Shepherd lay on a raised platform near the back of the kennel. Age had softened some of the sharpness that once belonged to a working dog. Gray fur surrounded his muzzle, and a faint disappeared beneath the darker fur near his shoulder. Even resting, he seemed aware of everything around him. His eyes moved first, not toward Sarah, toward Luke. The dog didn't stand, didn't bark, didn't growl, he simply watched. Sarah rested her clipboard against her side. "Most of our new volunteers don't come back here." Luke kept his attention on the kennel. "Why? At first they think he's aggressive, and after that?" She gave a small shrug. "They realize he's scared." That answer surprised him, not because it was wrong, because it was more honest than he expected. For a moment, neither of them spoke. Then Sarah continued. "He was a military working dog, special operations." Luke glanced toward her. "Who's his handler?" "Staff Sergeant Caleb Mercer." The name meant nothing to him, but Sarah spoke it with the care people use when talking about someone who mattered. She looked back at the kennel. Caleb was killed during a mission overseas. The words settled heavily between them. Sarah didn't dramatize the story. She didn't need to. The reports said Rook was injured too. By the time the recovery team reached them, he was still guarding Caleb. Luke looked at the German Shepherd again. The dog remained motionless. Only his eyes moved. Sarah folded her arms. "I've read the incident report 3 times. Why?" She smiled faintly. "I guess I wanted it to make sense." "Did it?" No. Luke understood that answer better than she knew. Some losses never became logical, no matter how many times a person replayed them. Sarah continued. "After he retired, a few different placements were attempted. None of them lasted very long. What happened?" "Different things." She hesitated. Sometimes he'd react badly to sudden movement. Sometimes loud noises. Sometimes flashing lights. Her eyes drifted toward the floor. "Most people thought he was being difficult." Luke nodded. "Most people usually do." Sarah looked up. "What does that mean?" Luke took his time answering. "When people don't understand fear, they often mistake it for disobedience." Sarah remained quiet. The hallway felt even stiller now. Outside, somewhere beyond the shelter walls, a lawnmower hummed faintly in the distance. Inside, the German Shepherd continued watching. After several minutes, Sarah finally asked the question that had clearly been sitting in her mind. "What are you seeing?" Luke looked toward the kennel. "A dog that's exhausted." Sarah frowned. "He sleeps almost all day." "I'm not talking about physical exhaustion." That made her pause. Luke rested a hand on the fencing. "He's paying attention to every sound in this building." Sarah looked back toward Rook. The longer she watched, the more she noticed. The dog's ears shifted constantly. His eyes tracked movement far beyond their conversation. Every opening, every footstep, every unfamiliar noise. Nothing escaped his attention. Luke spoke quietly. "He isn't waiting for something good to happen." Sarah didn't answer. "He is waiting for something bad to happen." The words lingered. For the first time since she'd met Rook, Sarah felt as though someone had described him in a way that actually fit. Not angry, not stubborn, not broken, just tired of being surprised by pain. Neither of them spoke for a while. Finally, Luke asked if he could move closer. After checking with a supervisor, Sarah returned and unlocked the secondary access area beside the kennel. Luke approached slowly, but there was nothing theatrical about the way he moved. He wasn't trying to prove that he understood dogs. He wasn't trying to impress Sarah, and he wasn't trying to force an outcome. Years of military service had taught him something most people forgot. Trust could not be demanded. It could only be offered. Rook lifted his head. The movement was small enough that someone unfamiliar with him might have missed it. Sarah didn't. Her eyes widened immediately. "He hasn't done that all morning." Luke said nothing. The dog continued watching him. A minute passed. Then another. The shelter around them seemed to disappear. There was only the quiet kennel, the aging German Shepherd, and a man who understood more than he wanted to admit. Eventually Rook stood. Not quickly, not dramatically, just carefully, as though testing a decision he wasn't entirely sure about. Sarah unconsciously held her breath. The dog took a few steps forward, then stopped, then came another step, and another, until only the fence separated them. Luke remained where he was. He didn't call the dog's name, didn't reach through the bars, didn't lean forward, The choice belonged to Rook. A few seconds later, the German Shepherd lowered his nose and touched the back of Luke's hand. The contact lasted less than a second. Yet Sarah felt her heart jump anyway, because in 6 months she had never seen him do that before. The first photograph arrived the following afternoon. Luke had just returned from a tower inspection outside Harrisburg when his phone vibrated on the kitchen counter. It was a picture of Rook. The German Shepherd stood in an exercise yard, wearing a basket muzzle and looking deeply unimpressed by the entire situation. A message appeared beneath the photo. He spent 10 minutes judging everyone today. Luke stared at the screen for a moment. Then he replied, "Sounds exhausting." 3 dots appeared almost immediately. "You sound like you've met him." Luke found himself smiling before he realized it. That became the beginning of a routine neither of them planned. Over the following weeks, Sarah sent updates almost every day. Some were photographs, some were short videos, some were nothing more than a sentence about how Rook had eaten breakfast without hesitation, or accepted a leash from a staff member he normally avoided. Luke rarely wrote long replies, but Sarah somehow managed to build entire conversations from a few words. She told him about difficult adoptions, successful adoptions, escaped kittens, and a volunteer who somehow managed to lose the shelter keys twice in the same week. Luke told her about communication towers, long drives, and what Pennsylvania looked like from 200 feet above the ground. To his surprise, she seemed genuinely interested. One evening she asked whether tower inspections were ever scary. Luke considered the question before answering. Only when people stop being careful. A minute later, her reply arrived. "That sounds exactly like something a Navy SEAL would say." He shook his head and put the phone away. A few seconds later, it vibrated again. For the record, I still think the serial answer was disappointing. For reasons he couldn't explain, the rest of his evening felt lighter. Meanwhile, changes were happening at the shelter. After discussing Luke's observations, the staff adjusted Rook's daily routine. His time outside the kennel increased gradually. Walks remained controlled and structured, but he spent less time isolated and more time moving through familiar environments. Progress came slowly. Some days were better than others, but Sarah noticed small differences. Rook finished his meals more consistently. He reacted less intensely when familiar staff approached. He no longer retreated immediately whenever someone entered his area. None of those changes would have impressed a casual visitor. Inside a shelter, however, people learned to celebrate small victories. Luke understood that better than most. One Saturday morning, Evelyn knocked on his front door carrying a wrench and a look of exaggerated frustration. "My kitchen faucet is leaking." Luke glanced at the wrench. "Did you already try fixing it yourself? I made it worse." "Of course you did." 20 minutes later, he was crouched beneath Evelyn's sink, tightening a connection that had never actually been very loose. When he emerged, she was standing near the window, smiling. That immediately made him suspicious. "What?" Evelyn pointed toward the kitchen table. Luke followed her gaze. His phone rested beside a cup of coffee. The screen was lit. A photograph of Rook filled the display. Sarah's latest message sat underneath. "He stole a volunteer's sandwich today. 0 regrets." Luke reached for the phone, too late. Evelyn had already seen the smile. Not a large smile, not even a particularly noticeable one, but it had been there. And they both knew it. "I see." Luke slipped the phone into his pocket. "You see what?" Evelyn's expression remained innocent. "Nothing," which meant everything. Luke shook his head. The conversation ended there, at least for the moment. Autumn continued settling across Pennsylvania. The trees turned brighter, the evenings grew colder, and somewhere along the way, checking his phone became part of Luke's day. Not because he expected anything important, just because he found himself wondering what Sarah or Rook had done. The realization was uncomfortable, so he mostly ignored it. Then came the phone call. It happened on a Thursday morning. Luke was driving west toward a telecommunications site outside Reading. The contract had been scheduled more than a week earlier, and the company expected him shortly after 9. He stopped at a red light near a busy intersection. Traffic moved steadily around him. His phone rang through the truck speakers. Sarah. The moment he answered, he knew something was wrong. Her usual energy was gone. "Luke, I'm here." She took a breath. "There was an incident this morning." His grip tightened slightly on the steering wheel. "What happened?" Sarah explained quickly. Rook had been out for his morning walk. Everything had seemed normal. He was wearing his muzzle. A staff member had control of the leash. Then a young man visiting the shelter asked if he could take a picture. The request seemed harmless. Nobody thought much about it, until the camera flash fired. Sarah's voice became quieter. Something changed immediately. Luke listened. The young visitor wasn't injured. Neither was Rook. But the German Shepherd had reacted violently. He lunged, pulled against the leash, began spinning and fighting the people trying to calm him. In the confusion, one employee suffered a shoulder injury while helping secure him. Nothing catastrophic, still serious enough. Sarah fell silent for a moment. "How is he now?" Luke asked. "They got him back into a kennel. And he isn't eating." Luke looked through the windshield. The traffic light remained red. What else? Another pause. "Longer this time," Sarah finally answered. "The directors are meeting." Luke didn't ask why, he already knew. Shelters had limited resources. Limited space. Limited options. The words didn't need to be spoken aloud. Sarah exhaled softly. "I'm sorry, for what?" "I know you have work today." Luke looked ahead. Cars waited patiently beside him. The world continued exactly as it always had. "I shouldn't have called." "I'm glad you did." Another silence settled between them. Then Sarah said something that bothered him far more than the rest. "He looked for you." Luke frowned. "What?" After they got him secured, her voice almost disappeared. He kept staring at the gate. The traffic signal turned green. Vehicles began moving. Sarah noticed. "You should go." Luke didn't answer. "Everything's under control," she said. "I just wanted someone else to know." The call ended. Luke drove forward with the rest of traffic. 1 mile passed, then another. The contract site remained exactly where it had been an hour earlier. The company would still be waiting. The tower would still need inspection. Everything about the day still made sense. Except something didn't feel right. A few minutes later, a turnaround appeared ahead. Luke's eyes lingered on it longer than necessary. He thought about the contract, the schedule, the responsibility. Then he thought about a German shepherd sitting alone in a kennel, waiting, the same way he had waited beside a hospital phone 5 years earlier. Before he could change his mind, Luke turned the wheel. The truck crossed into the turnaround lane. A minute later, he was heading back toward Lancaster. At the next stoplight, he picked up his phone and sent a message. "I'm sorry, I won't be able to make it today." The drive back to Lancaster felt longer than it should have. Luke kept one hand on the steering wheel, while the conversation with Sarah replayed itself in his mind. The details hadn't changed since the phone call, but now that he was toward the shelter instead of away from it, the gaps in the story felt more important. A flash, a crowded moment, a frightened dog, an employee with an injured shoulder, and a meeting taking place behind closed doors. By the time he pulled into the shelter parking lot, the autumn sun had climbed high enough to wash the building in pale gold light. Sarah was already outside. She spotted his truck before he had fully parked. For a second, she simply stared. Then she hurried toward him. "What are you doing here?" Luke shut the door behind him. "I thought you said everything was under control." Sarah folded her arms. That wasn't really an answer. Neither was his. After a moment, she shook her head. "You were supposed to be at work." "I know." The fact that he had come anyway seemed to surprise her more than anything else. Inside the shelter, the atmosphere felt different from his previous visit. People were quieter. Several staff members spoke in low voices. A few glanced toward the isolated section of the building before quickly looking away. Sarah led Luke to a small office where security footage could be reviewed. The recording showed Rook's morning walk. At first, everything looked normal. The German shepherd moved calmly beside a handler he already knew. His body language appeared relaxed. There was no pulling against the leash, no signs of agitation. Then a young visitor approached. The shelter employee stopped to answer a question. The visitor crouched slightly and raised a phone. A bright flash exploded across the screen. Everything changed immediately. Rook jerked backward. His entire body tightened. The dog spun sharply and began pulling against the leash. The handler attempted to regain control. Another employee stepped in to help. Within seconds, confusion spread through the scene. Luke watched the footage twice. Then a third time. Nobody spoke while he studied the screen. Finally, Sarah asked, "What do you think?" Luke leaned back in the chair. "I don't think he was trying to attack anyone." One of the supervisors in the room looked skeptical. He injured an employee. I know. The supervisor crossed his arms. Then what are you saying? Luke pointed toward the screen. Watch his eyes. The footage replayed. The room remained silent. Luke continued. He isn't focused on the people. Nobody interrupted. He reacts the moment the flash goes off. The supervisor leaned closer. Luke nodded. Then he keeps reacting to everything around him. Sarah looked back at the screen. The more she watched, the more obvious it became. The dog wasn't targeting anyone. He was trying to escape something only he could see. Luke folded his hands. A camera flash. A stranger suddenly entering his space. A stressful environment. He paused. Sometimes trauma doesn't ask permission before it comes back. Nobody argued with him. Not because everyone agreed, because everyone knew there was some truth in it. Unfortunately, truth did not solve the shelter's problem. The meeting began shortly before noon. Luke wasn't invited into the conference room, but he didn't need to be. He had spent enough years around organizations to recognize difficult decisions when he saw them. The shelter had limited funding, limited space, limited staff. 6 months had already passed. Rook remained classified as a high-risk placement. No adoption applications, no permanent solution, only uncertainty. When the meeting ended, Sarah emerged first. Luke could read the answer before she spoke. They voted. His stomach tightened. Sarah nodded. The words came quietly. They approved behavioral euthanasia. Neither of them spoke for several seconds. People often imagine difficult decisions arriving with anger or drama. Most of the time they arrived with paperwork. Sarah looked away. I tried, I know. They all care about him. I know. That was what made it harder. Nobody involved was cruel. Nobody wanted this outcome. They had simply run out of options. At least that was what everyone believed. Luke stood. Where is he? Sarah looked up, in isolation. A few minutes later, they reached a separate holding area near the back of the building. The kennel was smaller than the one Rook normally occupied. Quieter too. The German Shepherd lay in the corner with his head resting on his paws. His food bowl remained untouched. Sarah unlocked the outer gate. Luke stepped inside. The dog noticed him immediately. What happened next stopped Sarah in her tracks. Rook stood, not cautiously, not reluctantly, the way a person rises from a chair after recognizing a familiar face. The German Shepherd crossed the kennel and stopped directly in front of Luke. His tail moved once, then again. Luke crouched and rested a hand against the side of his neck. The dog leaned into the contact. Neither of them seemed interested in moving away. Sarah had spent months trying to help this animal. She had never seen him look so calm. Luke remained there for several minutes. The decision arrived quietly, not as a sudden realization, not as a dramatic moment. More like something he had already known and was only now willing to admit. When he finally stood, he turned toward Sarah. What would it take? She frowned. What would what take? To adopt him. For a moment, she thought she had misheard. Then she realized he was serious. The next several hours became a blur of forms, interviews, policy reviews, and risk assessments. The shelter director joined them. So did the behavioral coordinator. Questions came from every direction. Did Luke understand the liability? Did he understand the training requirements? Did he understand the possibility of setbacks? The answer to every question remained the same. Yes. Not because he thought the situation would be easy, because he understood exactly how difficult it could become. At one point, the director closed a folder and looked directly at him. Love isn't enough. Luke nodded. I know. The older man seemed surprised. Most adopters argued. Luke didn't. After a moment, he continued. I'm not promising he'll never have bad days. The room remained quiet. I'm promising he won't have to face them alone. Nobody spoke for several seconds. By late afternoon, approval was granted. The shelter still had concerns. They also knew opportunities like this were rare. A retired military working dog. A former Navy SEAL. A realistic plan, a willingness to learn, and perhaps most importantly, patience. As the paperwork was finalized, Sarah walked beside Luke toward the parking lot. Rook followed a few steps behind. The leash looked unfamiliar in Luke's hand. The dog looked unfamiliar outside a kennel. Neither seemed entirely certain what came next. Luke wasn't either. But for the first time in a long while, uncertainty didn't feel like something to avoid. When they reached the truck, Rook paused beside the passenger door and looked up at him. Luke opened it. The German Shepherd climbed inside without hesitation. Sarah smiled. Luke noticed. What? Nothing. He recognized the expression immediately. It was the same one Evelyn used. That realization made him shake his head. A few minutes later, he pulled away from the shelter. Rook sat quietly in the passenger seat. Ahead of them waited a small house in Lidditz, a house carrying 5 years of silence. Neither of them knew it yet. But both were bringing old wounds home, and both were about to discover that healing rarely happens all at once. It usually begins with two strangers learning how to share the same space. The first few weeks were awkward, not difficult, not dramatic, simply awkward. Rook had spent months living inside a shelter and years living inside routines Luke could only guess at. The German Shepherd explored the house slowly, moving from room to room with cautious curiosity. He inspected corners, sniffed furniture, paused at windows. For the first few days, he rarely settled anywhere for long. Luke didn't force the issue. The shelter had given him folders full of recommendations, schedules, and behavioral guidelines. He read all of them. Then he did something equally important. He paid attention. Some mornings Rook wanted a longer walk. Other mornings he seemed content to sit quietly on the back porch and watch squirrels cross the fence line. When loud trucks passed the house, Luke noticed the way the dog's ears shifted. When unexpected noises came from the street, he noticed how quickly Rook's body became alert. None of it disappeared overnight. But little by little, the reactions softened. The untouched food bowls became empty food bowls. The restless nights became longer stretches of sleep. The tension that once seemed permanently woven into the dog's posture began to loosen. Progress arrived quietly, the way most meaningful changes do. Sarah remained part of that progress. At first, she visited because she genuinely wanted updates about Rook. Then she began stopping by when she delivered homemade cookies to Evelyn across the street. After that, the reasons became less specific. Sometimes she arrived carrying coffee. Sometimes she brought photographs from the shelter. Sometimes she simply appeared at the front door and said she was already in the neighborhood. Neither Luke nor Sarah seemed interested in examining those explanations too closely. One Saturday afternoon, they sat on the back porch while Rook slept in a patch of sunlight near the steps. Sarah was halfway through a story about a goat that had somehow escaped its enclosure twice in the same morning when she realized Luke was laughing. Not politely, not out of obligation, actually laughing. The realization interrupted her story completely. Luke noticed. What? Sarah smiled. Nothing. That answer sounded familiar, far too familiar. Evelyn had used it for months. Luke shook his head. Sarah continued smiling. The subject changed, but the moment stayed with both of them. As winter approached, another pattern emerged. Rook developed a habit. Every evening, after his final walk, he wandered down the hallway and lay beside a closed door near the end of the house. At first, Luke thought it was coincidence. Then it happened again, and again, and again. The dog never scratched at the door, never barked, never tried to push it open. He simply lay there, waiting, sometimes for 10 minutes, sometimes for hours. Sarah noticed it during one of her visits. What room is that? Luke didn't answer immediately. The silence answered for him. Sarah looked away first. She never asked again. Weeks passed. The routine continued. Rook would spend part of nearly every evening beside the same closed door. Luke found himself stopping in the hallway more often, looking at the handle, remembering. The room had belonged to another version of his life. The version that existed before phone calls from hospitals, before funerals, before 5 years of silence. One rainy afternoon in early spring, Luke finally made a decision. The house was quiet. Rain tapped softly against the windows. Sarah had stopped by after work. Rook was already waiting in the hallway. As if he knew. Luke stood in front of the door for a long time. Then he reached for the handle. The lock clicked. The door opened. Dust floated through the thin afternoon light. Nothing inside had changed. The bed remained where it had always been. Books still rested on the nightstand. Photographs still sat on shelves. A sweater hung over the back of a chair. The room looked less like a museum and more like someone had stepped out for a moment and forgotten to return. Rook entered first. His paws moved quietly across the floor. He explored the room with the same patience he had shown during his first days in the house. Sarah followed. She didn't comment, didn't ask questions, didn't offer comfort. She simply sat beside Luke on the edge of the bed. For a long time, nobody spoke. Then Luke began talking, not about the accident, not about the funeral, not about grief. He talked about Claire, the real Claire, the woman who sang off key whenever she cooked, the woman who always bought more books than she could finish, the woman who hated folding laundry but somehow loved organizing closets. He told stories Sarah had never heard, small stories, ordinary stories, the kind people usually forget to tell when someone dies. As the afternoon faded into evening, Claire slowly became more than a tragedy. She became a person again. Sarah listened without interruption. When Luke finally ran out of stories, neither of them felt the need to fill the silence. Outside, the rain continued falling. Inside, something had changed. Not because the pain disappeared, it hadn't. Not because the past stopped mattering. It never would. Luke simply understood something he had spent years avoiding. Moving forward wasn't the same as leaving someone behind. Remembering and living could exist in the same place. 1 year later, spring returned to Pennsylvania, the trees filled with leaves again, the parks filled with families again, and on a warm Saturday afternoon, Rook ran across an open field without a muzzle for the first time. His leash remained clipped to Luke's hand at first. Then it didn't. The German Shepherd sprinted through the grass, chasing nothing except the simple joy of movement. A few years earlier, that would have been impossible. Now it looked natural. Nearby, Evelyn sat on a park bench watching everything with obvious satisfaction. She claimed she was there for the sunshine. Nobody believed her. Sarah stood beside Luke near the walking path. For a while they watched Rook race across the field. Then Sarah reached for his hand. The movement was small, simple, almost hesitant. Luke looked down, then back toward the field where Rook was running. 5 years earlier, he would have pulled away. 5 years earlier, he would have convinced himself that holding on to the past meant holding on to love. Now he knew better, so he closed his hand around hers. Sarah smiled. This time, he didn't let go. Across the field, Rook slowed to a trot and turned back toward them. For a moment, all four of them occupied the same patch of spring sunlight: the retired Navy SEAL, the shelter worker, the old neighbor, the aging military dog. None of them had arrived there the way they expected, and maybe that was the point. Because the small house in Lititz was no longer a place where memories had been locked away. The memories were still there. So was the love. So was the loss. But now there was something else too. For the first time in many years, it felt like home. There's one image from this story that keeps coming back to me. Not the shelter. Not the adoption papers. Not even the day Rook finally ran across the park without a muzzle. It's the image of an old German Shepherd lying quietly in a hallway, day after day, in front of a closed door. He didn't scratch at it. He didn't bark. He didn't try to force it open. He simply stayed there. For a long time, I thought the story was about Luke rescuing a dog. By the end, I wasn't so sure. It felt more like a story about what happens when someone, or something, waits patiently beside the parts of our lives we're not ready to face yet. Most of us have a door like that. Maybe it's a room we avoid. Maybe it's an old photograph in a drawer. Maybe it's a name we haven't said out loud in years. And sometimes the thing that finally helps us open it isn't advice. It isn't strength. It isn't even time. Sometimes it's just the steady presence of another living soul. This story is fictional, but the experiences behind it are not. People lose spouses. Dogs carry scars nobody can see. Neighbors quietly look after each other. And every now and then, grace arrives in forms we weren't expecting. If this story reminded you of someone you've loved, someone you've lost, or even a pet that helped you through a difficult season, I'd love to hear about it in the comments. Feel free to share a memory, a prayer, or simply where you're watching from. And if you enjoy stories rooted in ordinary life, quiet resilience, and human connection, please consider liking and subscribing. As for me, I keep thinking about how Rook never once tried to open that door himself. He just waited beside it until Luke was ready. The older I get, the more I suspect that some of the most important people in our lives do exactly the same thing.